It started with smoke, chants, and the sound of glass breaking. By the time the police arrived, the crowd was already 10 streets deep, a living wave of fury moving toward the row of migrant hotels on the outskirts of Birmingham. At first, it looked like another protest. A few banners, a few chants, a few angry voices, but then the numbers kept coming. By nightfall, there were over 115,000 people, from pensioners waving flags to veterans in uniform, mothers holding their children, and teenagers live streaming what no broadcaster dared to show. Britain had been told to stay calm. Britain decided otherwise. They came not for speeches, but for answers. Answers that never came from Downing Street. Answers swallowed by official statements and polished press conferences. For months, the government promised control, compassion, and reform. Yet every week, another hotel, every week, another quiet village turned into a temporary asylum centre. And now the patience of a nation had finally snapped. The streets didn't hum tonight, they roared. The footage tells the story better than any government memo ever could. A sea of flags under floodlights, flares lighting up the night sky like fire from a century-old rebellion. Police lines broke before dawn. Even the riot shields looked uncertain as chants of "enough is enough" thundered across the Midlands. One protester shouted, "We're paying for this, and now we're paying the price." Another voice cut through the noise. "Where's our government now?" But there was no answer, only the echo of chants and the sirens that couldn't drown them out. By the time the Home Office issued its first statement, the country had already made up its mind. An isolated public disturbance, they called it. But how do you call 115,000 voices isolated? How do you call streets filled with flags, smoke and fury a disturbance? Britain wasn't disturbed. It was awake. Inside Westminster, the lights stayed on long past midnight. Ministers shuffled between back doors and black cars, their faces pale under the cameras they couldn't control. Reports came in from Manchester, Leeds and Portsmouth, all showing the same story. Hotels surrounded, police overwhelmed, communities standing shoulder to shoulder against the silence of power. It wasn't chaos, it was consequence. Years of warnings ignored, years of being told to be patient while taxpayers watched billions disappear into a system that forgot who it served. The irony, the very people who once warned of dividing the country had done exactly that. And tonight, that division wasn't drawn on paper, it was drawn on the streets. Thousands chanted under the windows of hotels paid for by their own taxes, where foreign flags fluttered behind closed curtains guarded by private security. What began as outrage had turned into symbolism. It wasn't about asylum anymore, it was about betrayal. Local MPs tried to calm the storm with press statements about national compassion and shared humanity, but compassion doesn't cost £8 million a day and humanity doesn't hide behind blackout curtains while locals queue at food banks. One journalist asked an MP, "Do you still believe Britain is under control?" The reply was silence. The kind of silence that tells you everything. At 2 a.m, police declared a state of emergency across 5 counties. By 3 a.m, footage showed convoys of vans filled with riot officers heading south. But the roads were blocked, not by violence, but by people. Entire towns came out to stand on bridges and corners, waving Union Jacks as if to remind Westminster what nation they had forgotten. On social media, the phrase "Britain is burning" and the match was lit in London trended for 12 hours straight before mysteriously disappearing. Accounts were suspended, videos removed, but it didn't matter. The truth was already out. You can censor words, but you can't censor a movement. By dawn, the aerial footage was undeniable. From Birmingham to Bristol, hotels ringed by crowds stretching for miles. And somewhere between those crowds, the question everyone was too afraid to ask began to echo. If this is just the beginning, what comes next? By the next morning, Britain was unrecognisable. The skyline wasn't filled with smoke from factories or morning fog. It was the residue of unrest, the kind that doesn't vanish with daylight. From Birmingham to Bristol, every city carried the same headline written across its streets. "The people have had enough." The government tried to call it civil disorder, but even the press struggled to repeat that line with a straight face. Reporters whispered that this was no protest anymore, it was a reckoning. And the irony, The country didn't collapse because of outside threats. It collapsed because the people inside it finally decided to stand up. Inside the Home Office, the mood was cold, frantic, and desperate. Officials shuffled through briefing folders marked urgent, but none of them could find a solution that didn't make them look weak. One leaked document even warned that control of narrative has been lost entirely. The Prime Minister hadn't appeared in public for 24 hours, and Downing Street's black gates were now guarded by rows of police who refused to make eye contact with the cameras. In the streets, chants grew louder. "Where's our leader? Who speaks for Britain now?" No one answered because the truth was brutal. No one could. Meanwhile, the footage kept spreading. A drone clip from Manchester showed thousands surrounding 3 hotels, their flags glowing in the flare light like embers of defiance. In Liverpool, the crowd sang, "Rule Britannia," while blocking entryways to another temporary shelter. Every chant was both patriotic and furious, love and anger colliding in one voice. They weren't asking for permission anymore. They were demanding their country back. Social media became the only parliament left that the people trusted, but even there, censorship rolled like fog. Videos vanished, posts disappeared, accounts suspended. Still, the clips resurfaced faster than they could be deleted, mirrored, reposted, shared through encrypted channels. When truth becomes forbidden, it becomes unstoppable. The BC tried a different strategy, silence. Their 6 p.m. news opened with a cooking segment pretending the nation wasn't splitting apart outside their own headquarters. ITV read from a government-approved statement describing public discontent exaggerated by misinformation. But people had already seen the streets, they had seen the fire, the flags, the defiance, and they weren't buying the script anymore. A country once ruled by headlines was now ruled by hashtags. At 8 p.m, the Prime Minister finally appeared for a 60-second statement filmed behind closed doors, eyes tired, voice trembling. He called for calm, promised decisive action, and ended with the words, "Britain stands united." But outside, no one was standing still. A voice in the crowd outside Parliament shouted, "United under what? Lies?" Within minutes, the video of that shout had millions of views shared with the caption, "The nation has spoken." By midnight, the unrest spread north. Glasgow, Newcastle and Sheffield, all cities that had watched quietly for years, now joined in. Police resources ran thin and officers began to resign mid-shift, saying they wouldn't raise batons against their own neighbours. Leaked radio chatter revealed senior officers warning of a complete collapse of public order within 48 hours. The government called an emergency Cobra meeting at dawn, but insiders leaked the minutes before the meeting even ended. The memo was titled Operation Resolve Restore Confidence. But confidence cannot be restored. With curfews and censorship, it must be earned. And while the men in suits argued about language and liability, the streets were already rewriting the nation's story. One banner in Portsmouth said it best, "We built this country. Now we're rebuilding it without you." The roar of the crowd echoed across bridges and boulevards, a sound no government could mute, because the truth had already changed shape. It wasn't a headline anymore. It was alive, breathing, marching. As dawn broke again, the cameras caught something chilling. Crowds outside the migrant hotels kneeling in silence, heads bowed, not in violence but in mourning. Mourning for a country that had forgotten its people. And in that silence, one question rose again, sharper than ever. If the people no longer trust their leaders, how long before they stop obeying them? By the third day, the illusion of control had completely evaporated. Britain wasn't waiting for leadership anymore. It was leading itself. The streets had become a parliament of their own, where chants replaced debates and truth marched louder than policy. Reports poured in from across the nation, convoys of protesters moving toward London, supply chains halted, trains packed with demonstrators waving Union Jacks from the windows. News anchors hesitated on air, unsure whether to call it unrest or revolution. Every word now carried risk, every sentence a potential trigger. The line between protest and uprising had blurred beyond recognition. In the corridors of power, panic turned to paralysis. Ministers argued behind closed doors about whether to deploy the military, but even that option had lost its certainty. The Defence Secretary warned that many soldiers wouldn't follow such orders, saying quietly, "We don't fight the people, we serve them." It was the kind of statement no government wanted leaked, but of course it leaked anyway. Within hours, veterans across the nation reposted it, captioned simply, "The oath still stands." For a country that prided itself on discipline, this was mutiny in slow motion. Downing Street became a fortress under siege. Police barricades lined Whitehall. Helicopters circled overhead, and yet inside those walls, the air was thick with disbelief. How had it come to this? How had a government that spoke endlessly of order created the loudest chaos in generations? Advisors suggested the Prime Minister resign, but he refused, insisting that Britain needs stability. Stability. The word itself felt like satire now. The public no longer saw leaders, they saw actors reading scripts that no one believed. Meanwhile, outside the capital, the People's Movement grew more organised, not less. In Southampton, volunteers distributed food and first aid to the crowds. In Manchester, local shop owners opened their doors for free water and blankets. It wasn't lawlessness, it was community reborn from exhaustion. Across social media, the phrase "Britain belongs to the people" became a digital banner of defiance. Every deleted post reappeared 1,000 times elsewhere. Censorship was no longer a deterrent, it was fuel. By evening, the government's blackout expanded. Broadcasts were replaced by reruns and documentaries about national unity. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Ordinary citizens streamed the protests themselves, narrating their own history live from the streets. A grandmother in Leeds went viral after shouting into her phone camera, "We raised a country, not a colony." Her clip reached 20 million views in 6 hours. The old Britain, the quiet, obedient, reserved Britain, was gone. What rose in its place was something raw, unfiltered, and unafraid. At 10 p.m, the first military convoys rolled through London, not to attack, but to assist. Armoured vehicles parked along Westminster Bridge. Engines idle, soldiers staring out the windows at the thousands of people waving the flag they'd sworn to defend. Some soldiers saluted the crowd, others lowered their helmets, ashamed. The footage was shared worldwide. France called it the night Britain met itself again. America called it the British awakening. And inside the British press room, silence. No one dared to write what everyone already knew. Authority was no longer in power, it was in question. The Prime Minister's team drafted a speech titled "Rebuilding Trust." But how do you rebuild something when the foundation itself has cracked? How do you preach unity to a nation that no longer believes your words carry weight? The cabinet members argued over tone. Too soft, it looks weak. Too firm, it sounds cruel. But outside, no one cared about tone. They cared about truth. And truth by then was something the government no longer owned. As midnight struck, the chants outside Parliament shifted from anger to resolve. "You work for us!" echoed down the avenues, a reminder that power, once borrowed, could also be revoked. Journalists whispered that several members of Parliament had already fled the capital. The stock market dipped again, foreign embassies raised alerts, and yet for most Britons, it wasn't fear anymore, it was clarity. The kind that comes after years of being ignored, the kind that doesn't fade when the cameras turn off. By dawn, crowds began moving again, this time not to destroy, but to reclaim. They swept streets, removed barricades, and replaced broken signs with banners reading, "This is our home." The nation was changing, not collapsing. A silent realisation spread across Britain. Maybe the real threat was never the protesters or the migrants, but the deafness of those in power. And as sunlight spilled over the quieted streets, one question lingered like smoke in the air. When power forgets who it serves, who reminds it of its place? By the fourth day, the crisis had evolved into something no government manual had ever prepared for. A rebellion without leaders, a movement without parties, and a silence louder than any speech. The cameras that once dictated public opinion now merely followed it, capturing a nation that had finally realised its strength. Outside the migrant hotels that had sparked the fury, the crowds were no longer shouting. They were standing, tens of thousands of them, shoulder to shoulder, in complete silence. The smoke had cleared, the noise had faded, but what remained was far more powerful, unity born from betrayal. Britain had stopped listening to politicians. It was now listening to itself. Inside Downing Street, time seemed to stand still. The Prime Minister sat in front of an untouched cup of tea, surrounded by advisers who had run out of excuses. Every attempt to restore calm had only ignited new flames. Every statement meant to reassure had exposed how far removed Westminster had become from the reality outside its gates. Intelligence reports described the crowds as calm but resolute, a phrase that terrified ministers more than violence ever could. Violence can be controlled, silence cannot. The Cobra Room was filled with exhausted faces, eyes glued to live feeds showing streets packed with people holding candles instead of torches, signs instead of slogans. One official whispered, "They're not rioting anymore, they're waiting." Waiting for what? No one dared to ask. Perhaps they were waiting for truth, perhaps for accountability, or perhaps for something much simpler. The sound of a government finally listening. The media blackout had collapsed under its own weight. Journalists began to rebel, refusing to read government-prepared statements. Newspapers printed blank front pages with a single question in bold. Who speaks for Britain now? Across the country, church bells rang at noon, not as a call to worship, but as a call to remember. From factory towns to coastal villages, people stood in doorways listening to the bells echo across the country, rediscovering its conscience. At 6 p.m, the Prime Minister made one final attempt to address the nation. The camera lights came on, the teleprompter flickered, and yet the words felt lifeless before they were even spoken. The government is in control, he began, but outside, tens of millions already knew the truth. Control had left the building days ago. The power he claimed to hold was now in the hands of those standing in the streets. As he spoke of unity and order, the nation watched in disbelief. His voice trembled, not from emotion, but from realisation that his words were no longer commands, merely echoes. And then, in a moment that history would replay endlessly, the broadcast cut out, not by protesters, not by hackers, but by the broadcaster itself. Screens went black. On social media, the hashtag #BlackoutBritain trended instantly, followed by another, "We're the Voice." Within minutes, the people created their own live streams, uncensored, unfiltered, unstoppable. Teachers, veterans, single mothers, students, all speaking in one chorus. We are Britain. We are not broken. As the night deepened, a strange calm swept across the country. No sirens, no shouts, just the low hum of a nation exhaling after years of suffocation. Soldiers at checkpoints laid down their helmets. Police officers shook hands with protesters. The walls between authority and the public began to dissolve. For the first time in decades, Britain wasn't defined by its politics, it was defined by its people. By dawn, Parliament Square was filled again, not with chaos, but with order of a different kind. Veterans lined the front. Teachers and nurses stood behind them, and children held signs that read, "We are the future you forgot." It wasn't an uprising anymore, it was a reckoning written in compassion and courage. Britain hadn't burned down, it had burned away the illusions that kept it silent. Inside number 10, the Prime Minister finally stepped outside, not to speak, but to listen. The crowd parted, silent, waiting. No boos, no chants, just the sound of a flag rustling in the wind. In that moment, it became clear leadership isn't taken by vote or force, it's given by trust, and that trust was gone. The man turned back toward the door and Britain turned forward toward itself. Across the cities, candles flickered in every window, a silent oath that the people would no longer be forgotten. The country had survived scandals, wars and lies, but this was different. This was the rebirth of a nation's voice. And as the sun rose over a Britain forever changed, one truth echoed across every home, every heart, every headline. The lion wasn't roaring in anger anymore. It was roaring in remembrance, because once a nation remembers who it is, no power on earth can silence it again.